So Tom Hudson moved from Texas to New Hampshire in '95, long time ago, long before any of us. He's lived in several places across the line of live free or die state. However, now he calls the Seacoast home because the Seacoast is the best, of course, in the state. So he's been doing the Up Rev Ninja podcast since June of 2017 with the intent of leveling up his life as well as his audiences in all aspects of life, relationships, financial, spiritual, productivity, physical, emotional, etc. So each week he interviews a guest on his show that has something to do with one of those fantastic topics. It's a great show. Dr. Stephanie Murphy, PhD, is a radio host, freelance voice artist, and scientist with a long-standing interest in freedom that she's explored in many different ways. In addition to hosting Pork Therapy, she's a host of the popular podcast Let's Talk Bitcoin, and is also a host on Sunday, used to be on Free Talk Live. This must be an Ohio. I should have read it. Sorry. So Stephanie is doing Let's Talk Bitcoin and Sex and Science Hour is her latest one. She sometimes has Dr. Brian Sovryn on. And so on to Dr. Brian Sovryn. He is the proprietor and developer of the Sovryn offline games, as well as the creator and host of the podcast Sovryn Tech. His background in technology comes from years spent with multiple tech companies, the U.S. Army, and from being involved in the cyberpunk community since the late 1990s. He also has a doctorate of divinity. He also did some co-hosting on Free Talk Live for a while. And on to Brett. He also was on Free Talk Live for a while. I think me and Tom are the only ones up here that haven't been. So Brett Veinotte is a former teacher trainer, and college admissions consultant. After a decade of diverse, eye-opening professional experience as an educator, he created the School Sucks podcast to discuss his discoveries. As the show expanded, he focused in on a central mission of helping young people achieve greater individual liberty through self-knowledge, self-teaching, and self-mastery. So let's give one more round of applause to our panelists. So the way I want to do this is, in these kind of panels, you guys don't really want to hear what I want to know from these guys. You want to hear what you want to know from these guys. So I really want a lot of audience participation. So if you have questions, feel free to step up to the mic. I'm going to start off with one. Why did you choose podcasting as the medium to get your specific message out? Whoever's wants to grab it.
When I was a boy, I don't know, I was, from a very young age, I was interested in talking and saying something meaningful and having people listen. So that, led me to get a degree in communications and look for ways to be involved in radio and television. And in 2009, when I started the show, I had, listened to podcasts. I'd listened to Free Talk Live, I'd listened to Complete Liberty and a few other shows. And I felt like it was a format that met my needs as a communicator, better than writing would. And the barrier to entry was very low. It was lower than I actually thought it. The barrier to entry was like a little above where I thought it was. I went to Radio Shack and bought like a $10 microphone. The barrier to entry was probably like twice that much initial investment, but I made it work for a few episodes and built the following, so I was able to improve that pretty quickly. But it was always the way that I like to communicate. And when it became easy and available, and I saw other people with a similar philosophy doing it, I thought I would at least give it a try.
So I have a face for radio. That's reason enough. No, I'm kidding. The reason I chose podcasting, kind of similar to what Brett was saying, where it is the barrier to entry is incredibly small. I mean, some of the biggest podcasts that I listen to personally get recorded on an iPhone. I mean, it's that it can be done just like that, and very basic. But really, for me, the beauty of it is that with podcasting, one person, not that the barrier to entry, not because it's expensive or something like that, but because one person can really create in audio and audio alone could create an entire world, especially when you look into the history of radio. I mean, you look at a lot of the great hosts and DJs and people that produced like fiction shows, not just nonfiction, but fiction shows for radio. Like it was usually one guy, who maybe would have cellophane and could make, fire sounds, or they would take a plastic water bottle and it would sound like somebody snapping their neck, something like that. But one person could do all that. And so, the overhead, for me, I guess, is maybe the biggest reason that I, got into podcasting, was that, you could get these tremendous production values on your own, completely on your own, and also it would be, relatively inexpensive to do that. So, yeah, I think that's my answer. But most important is I have a face for radio.
Yeah, I like what was said. I think my biggest reasons for choosing podcasting as a medium are because the barrier to entry was low, and also because it's such a personal medium. Like when your voice is in somebody's ears, you really feel as a listener like you're getting to know them. And I was definitely a fan of several podcasts before I started doing my own. And I always liked the intimacy of the medium and how you could really reach people. And when listening to a podcast, you really feel like you know the person who's podcasting. It's almost like they're sitting in the room across from you having an intimate conversation. And there was something about that I really liked. At the time, I was not a full-time podcaster. I started my first podcast as a hobby. I had a line of work where I was able to listen to podcasts pretty much all day, and I became almost obsessed with them. And it wasn't too long before I thought, okay, I really have to start my own. And I was just amazed at how many people took to me as a host as I did to other podcasts that I listened to, how my voice reached people, and I got feedback and engagement almost right away. And I was working in science at the time, which is, it can feel kind of cold and impersonal, but in the meantime, I was podcasting about relationship talk, and that sort of allowed me to talk about more personal topics as well.
I hate writing, and I am no good at it. I can talk all day, though. I think that's really the core reason I got into podcasting was, I enjoy conversation. I enjoy meeting new people. And, part of the Free State Project, every year, I remember 15 years ago when it was like the first 10 movers. And it was pretty phenomenal. But throughout the years, more and more people, you get to meet them, their families, hear their stories. And I was on this journey trying to figure out who I was. I came through this whole thing about, I'm an atheist. What does that mean now? What's a libertarian? That word was not in my vocabulary, although that's more or less who I was. I got into on the dating side of things as well. Being a date coach, and I really learned a lot about people, about relationships, what triggered people in their relationships. So that's really kind of what got me starting the podcast I got today. I hate writing about it, but I'll talk about it all the time, and I love trying to pull the answers out of people, trying to figure out what question it is, ask them to get those answers.
Nice. So do we have any questions from the audience yet? I'd love to get some participation from you guys. So come up with some questions, and I'll go ahead and go on to my next one. Podcasting has exploded the last 2 or 3 years. Not only podcast listeners, but podcasters and podcasts. How do you, with all of this noise, differentiate your show from everybody else who's, doing what you're doing? Some good, some not so good. But how do you differentiate your voice and your signal from theirs?
I don't know if I actually do. It's not necessary. It's so difficult, and you're right. I've done a lot of podcast guesting, which I believe is what I need to do now to get my show out more in front of people. My niche, you go out there, you type in, I don't honestly think I have a niche. There's a ton of shows out there that are all trying to help you become the best version of who you are. So I think it's really just trying to connect with the host. And if you feel that I think going back to Stephanie, if your audience has that affinity towards you and they love you and they like having you in their ears, then that's the people you're trying to connect with. And I think one of the big misconceptions, well, in any product that you're trying to launch, you're always trying to launch it to that one key person, and that's who you're trying to reach. Kevin Kelly wrote an article 10, 15, 20 years ago called 1,000 True Fans. And Tim Ferriss talks about this, a lot of people talk about this. Don't try to speak to the 7+ billion people in the world, just really try to connect with those 10, 100, 1,000 people, and they'll be rabid, they'll be your caliphate.
Yeah, I really like that, Tom. I think one of the best ways you can differentiate yourself is to listen to your own show and critique yourself and learn how to critique yourself really well. That's something that I started doing from the very first podcast that I did. I actually couldn't wait to listen back to it. I listened back to it even before it was released, but then again, like after it was released. Partially just because, this is gonna sound terrible, but I like to hear myself talk. I think you kind of have to if you have a podcast. So part of it was that, but part of it was like, I wanna see how I did. I wanna see how I stack up and compare to the podcast that I enjoy listening to. And every podcast that I listen to regularly, I would try to pick out something about it that I liked and then try to integrate that into my own version of podcasting. So I guess it's like taking those little pieces of art and then combining them into a collage for my own work. I think that's the biggest tip I could give to differentiate yourself. Learn to self-critique.
Yeah, all good answers. I think, and maybe this is one of the questions, if it is, I'm sorry I'm taking it out of order, but it's important first to ask, why are you doing a podcast? Like, what's the why? And you've got to be able to answer that. And for me, my why was no one else was sharing my opinions. My opinions were not being represented, especially I have a tech podcast. How many people here listen to Sovryn Tech? I'm ashamed. Okay. So I'm doing it wrong. So you might not want to listen to me because none of you have listened to me, but that's okay. But anyway, the why is because in the tech world, particularly, some of the opinions that would be held by people at this event aren't exactly out there. So that's part of the reason that I started doing it. So right there, I knew, where's my differentiation? No one else is saying this. Now you don't want to just make stuff up, okay? Can we swear? Are we allowed to do that? Absolutely. You don't want to just make shit up, okay? Because here's the thing, is that consciously or unconsciously, especially like Stephanie said, how it's a very personal medium. It's right in between people's ears. It's like right in their head. They're going to know if you're bullshitting. They're going to know if you're full of it and what you're saying and if you don't actually believe what you're putting out there, they will absolutely know. And I don't care how good of an editor you are, you can't hide it. So you might as well just go full crazy and let your crazy out there, and that's your real differentiator. Because we're all individuals, we know this here, okay? And just be nuts. Say the craziest thing. If you think aliens created the pyramids, go ahead, just let it rip, because sooner or later they're gonna find out anyway, okay? Or at least...
Example of a crazy thing, though.
Of a crazy thing? Well, right, yeah, just tell me you're a libertarian. But that's for me, the real differentiator is knowing if you, first off, answer if you are really delivering something unique, then you already have it. But then, beyond that, just let it go, let it rip, and I guarantee you have something unique that you're putting out there. And that's your major differentiator. The other thing you can do is if you know that there's aspects of yourself that aren't popularly talked about, not just that it's different, as in like in my podcast, frankly, if you listen to it, this is a very rated R, dare I say rated X podcast in a very real sense. You'll hear people moaning, you'll hear all kinds of wild stuff in it, okay? Nobody else does this, and I know it, and that is a major differentiator for me. But it's also an aspect of who I am. My sexuality is very important to me. So those are things that you can do, is you can add in those kind of elements that maybe you don't hear anywhere else, but also be prepared for the fact that you might have to rely on what Tom said is the 1,000 true fans, because you may not get more than 1,000. In fact, the average podcast has 100 listeners, if that. So good luck, with that.
The average podcast has 12 listeners.
Or you're above average if it's over 100.
And the average podcast only lasts 7 episodes.
That's right. Yeah, I was actually going to talk about that. There was a study done by Libsyn, which is one of the most popular podcast hosts, and they found some really interesting statistics about podcasting, which I think was what Rodger was referencing, where the average podcast only goes for 7 episodes, and each episode has about 12 listens on average.
So speaking of, how many episodes do each of you have of your podcast? I'm on number 80. My 80th came out this week. Tom, or well, since it's in front of Brian.
I have lost count. I'm up in the high hundreds, probably almost 1,000.
Sovryn Tech is up to episode 264 or 265, but I've actually, with Patreon content and specials, it's probably around 600, 500, 600, something like that.
School Sucks has maybe like 570 public episodes and then maybe like another 400 that are behind a paywall. And Tom?
I'm the virgin here. Right. 38 just came out this past week, but I've got 30 in the can.
Nice, nice. Any questions from out there yet? Okay, here we go.
And can you just, one more time, how do we differentiate ourselves is the question?
Yeah, how do you differentiate yourself from all the other noise out there? Because let's be honest, there's some really bad podcasts out there that do get some listens. How do you keep yourself a step above?
Okay, well, I think it's something that a lot of us, especially in this, I mean, we're all here because our podcasts at least have a kind of libertarian slant to them. And, I think niching down is important. I went beyond that because just in that whole libertarian podcast space, you have people like, Tom Woods, who's a marketing pro, and he's a name. So how can I go in further and get people that he's not going to get? And, it was a lot of the things that other people said about being yourself and also kind of knowing and embracing your story. I had this unique perspective working in education, and I thought that was, as much as there's like attractive things out there that I want to talk about, and then I have taken the bait. Like Stephanie and Brian and I, we do the series called Conspirathon, which has nothing to do with the target of my show. I mean, maybe I can tie it in. I get creative with the tie-ins and say, it's about critical thinking, but it's not. It's just fun. We're just having fun and being silly, and I do a lot of stuff like that. So there's the balance of like remembering the audience that I've attracted and why, based on niching down from like individual liberty to individual liberty delivered through self-directed education. And I need to remember to focus on that, but I also have to balance that with being myself. I sit in front of the recorder in a room alone all the time, and I say something, and then I giggle, and then I delete it, right? But that's the stuff that's the most me, and I need to remember that, as I'm trying to attract this 1,000 true fan group, those are people who, for whatever personal reasons they have, like me, when me comes through, and I need to embrace that and let that out. I mean, for up until recently, I was sort of offloading a bunch of like the real ways I think and feel and want to be onto another New Hampshire podcast called Puke in the Gang, because it was inappropriate for me to talk in some of these ways on my show. My show was supposed to be serious, but I'm not a serious man. I mean, look at me, right? Listen to me. But, there's other things too, if I could just say one more thing on that. Over time, I started my show thinking it was just going to be like 10 episodes where I could vent about all the things I couldn't say anywhere else in my educational career, because I'd been fired. I wouldn't be a good college consultant if I was telling kids not to go to college, right? That's what I wanted to tell them. So there was this like conflict that the podcast, was like a valve to let steam out. And so it served that need for me, but as it went on and it started attracting an audience, we would absorb huge amounts of people from other podcasts like Free Talk Live and Free Domain Radio. And when the Free Domain Radio thing happened, like 2009, 2010, I was like, gosh, I really need to behave myself and please these people, right? And I felt that way for a while. And eventually it was just a matter of keeping that balancing act going of, okay, this is why people are here. This is the mission of this show that I have to serve with our content, but people are also here for me, for whatever reason, these people like me, so I have to be that person delivering this message.
You're absolutely right. I mean, it does have to do with content, of course. People come for the content.
Right.
They stay because of your personality. I mean, personality does have a lot to do with it. Because let's be honest, there's a lot of people out there giving their ideas on whatever, Donald Trump did last week. But it's your personality that's going to differentiate you from everybody else.
Right, and I think that it's also being realistic about what the competition is, right? One of the things that people seem to love the most that I do is like to do critiques of mainstream media. and like late night comedians and stuff. Can I do that as well as Ben Shapiro? Absolutely not. So I should probably lay off that and pursue something that's more unique. Even if it's something that I'm good at, even if it's something that I like doing, there's better ways to direct my focus. So it's kind of look to go inward but also outward and look at what the landscape is and look at what's available and say, can I compete with so-and-so in this area? And if not, how can I refocus my attention to give the people who are already here what I want? Because by doing that and by being true to that, I think that's how you attract new people too. Yes, ma'am.
To what, all right, so what differentiates you outside of the fact that, like, as New Hampshire podcasters, and kind of along with that, to what degree, when you have been in the process of building your audience, has it been, this is sort of related, but sort of not, has it been sort of the old-fashioned or organic way as opposed to electronically? Meaning, when you first started going and telling your friends and neighbors and relatives in person and over Thanksgiving or dinner or whatever, hey, you guys, check me out on, and then they tell their friends or whatever, versus sending out blast emails that this is my new podcast.
Can I take that first? Okay. I don't know if we're voting here, if we believe in that, but so first off, you could do it better than Ben Shapiro, Brett, by a long shot. But second off, as far as that goes, like we mentioned earlier, the average podcast doesn't get over 100 listeners. So my show, Sovryn Tech, I think I started off with 200 listeners in my first episode. How did I do that? How did that happen? Honestly, it was because the week previous, I was on Free Talk Live. I was a guest host on Free Talk Live, and that's what broke that number, is being able to do that. Now, how to do it from square one or square zero of how to start building up, especially locally with people around you, that can be tough, because while you want to be niche, you don't want to be so niche that it's just New Hampshire. New Hampshire is an awesome base because you can end up at events like this, right? And then I can talk to people like you, and you can start building up from there. But I think it's important to have, and this is if you get critical of the media, maybe Brett could agree with this, but if you get critical on the media likes to create boogeymen. Podcasters should do the same thing. You don't have to be mean or harsh, or lives don't have to be on the line and nobody's going to war like it is in the news. But I think having some kind of angle that you're going after, like a group that you're going after, say being critical about the media, like Brett was talking about, and things like this, that will get you, I think that gets your foot in the door when you have something that you're kind of going against. I know there's so many people that say, oh, you only want to be for what you're for. No, that's horseshit. You really need to have something that you're going against to get passionate about, because that's what people respond to, is the passion in your, Rodger was saying about having personality, you gotta have that passion. And that's an easy way. In the wrestling business, they call it cheap heat, okay? You build up heat, and that's what allows you to start creating that audience. And maybe you can leverage social media with that. Okay, to where, or maybe it is a local thing, like you're talking about some local New Hampshire news person or something like that. I don't know. I mean, again, you don't have to be mean, but at least you got to have something, I think, that you're working against in a way. So maybe we'll go on from there.
So Brian, are you looking for a podcast nemesis to create beef with?
So this is a big secret. If anyone ever wants to try this, the hard part is finding somebody that can pull this off with you. Is that behind the scenes, you find somebody who you can create what they call a pod beef, where it's two podcasts that are the hosts are just constantly at each other's throats, be it actually on air or just they mention it when they're on air or something like that. And I think you can create a tremendous audience if you give that kind of excitement, kind of like almost this gang warfare, for lack of a better term. But that's a big secret. And you know what, real quick, if I can, I'll give you one other secret of how to get your podcast going really quickly. Tom, how many episodes did you have, you say?
Got 38 out right now.
38, okay. When you start your podcast, start it at number 169 or 170. Nobody will know. And you can just tell them, if they ask you, it's like, well, where's the rest of your episodes in your feed? Just say to them, well, there's... No, just, you can do that. Yeah, you can do that and make it a really high price. Or just say, oh, there's this terrible accident. And then you have this tremendous story to tell them about, when all these server farms went down And if you're like one of the conspiratorial type libertarians, you could say, well, as you know, it was the man. It was the government. They did it all. It's the NWO. You know, and so, yeah, right. It's lizard Jews or something. You know, there we go. I've been accused of that, but anyway. So those are tricks. Anyway, I'll carry on.
So the thing I love about being a podcaster who lives in New Hampshire, and also I'm a voice actor. I used to be a scientist, I changed careers. I'm a voice actor now. I do audiobooks and commercials and all kinds of stuff, but I do it all from my home studio in New Hampshire. And the thing I love about that is that I don't have to live in New York or LA. You know, I can live in awesome New Hampshire and do my work in my pajamas, and I can be talking to thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people all around the world. And that's the great thing about the internet. So I think there is a place for localism, you know, being relevant to a local community, but I just like the fact that, you know, I'm not limited to only talking to people who I know in person, and I can do this type of work that wasn't accessible to people who lived in rural areas in the past from home.
So this is interesting, like 70% of my audience is out of Australia. I've got no clue how or why.
He's huge in Australia.
I'm probably like 80% of my guests are from that area too. So it's really interesting. So I don't know how that happened. New Hampshire's third, California is second. But I think a couple of things. Yeah, I had not thought of starting out at episode 169. I probably would have started at 69, but you know, so that's brilliant. Podcast guesting, that's where I've been getting a lot of traffic, you know, joining other podcasts and talking about whatever, you know, topic, and obviously it's free advertising. That's one avenue, social media. The other piece I've got a lot of value out of joining Facebook podcast groups and sharing like tips, tricks, hacks, you know, how do you do this? You know, I ask those questions, or if I can't figure something out in Adobe Audition, post it in there, and then that's the big way, just networking.
So while you pass it on to Brad, towards pod beefing, one of I think the second or third highest state that I get listeners from is Indiana, because I have a pod beef with We Are Libertarians co-host Chris Veinotte. So I get a ton of listens from them because they're like, hey, you know, Chris doesn't like this guy, why? And of course we're actually friends in real life. But you're right, it does make a big difference. It does, absolutely.
All right, so if the four of us agreed to secretly pod beef with each other, will you guys keep that quiet? Yeah, exactly. It's interesting because we actually tried a form of this. And this is nice because we're all in New Hampshire. We were able to all sit at a table and do it together. But last year, we did a series where we were talking about social issues in their political context. And we had a lot of Stephanie, Brian, and I had a lot of disagreement on these issues. But the way we did it was dumb because we're like, oh, we're actually going to try and get along and understand each other, and that's not how you beef, you know? But honestly, I'm glad we did it the way we did it, because it was kind of like friendship is more important than those kinds of disagreements, and that's a good transition to the benefits of being able to do this here. I never thought about actually attracting a New Hampshire audience. I figured there were a lot of people here who would listen, and I was right. And there are actually like communities of people here, like on the Seacoast, where there's a lot of parents, there's a lot of people who are doing unschooling and alternative education. And you know, that's a place where I can go and plug myself in and feel welcome and you know, chat with people and get ideas. But really, being in New Hampshire, the benefit has been so much more on the production side. I started doing the show just out into the internet, not thinking I might ever meet anybody who's listening. And I was in Newmarket, New Hampshire, which is kind of near the Seacoast, kind of near UNH. I had maybe 5 episodes, and this guy, Ofer, writes to me, and he's like, hey, I'm in Dover, I've been listening. You need a website if you're going to have a podcast. And we started meeting, and then he plugged me into the whole Dover community. Started going to meetups, people there knew who I was. I thought it was an amazing thing. I had an endless collection of people that could come on the show and have something meaningful to say. My friend Dale built a studio in the attic of a building that he owned, and we did our first live show there starting in 2012. All the opportunities that I've had with Stephanie and Brian are because I've been in New Hampshire. So it's created lots of opportunities and lots of like face-to-face encouragement. So we have a unique situation where there is a community here that is around individual liberty. Even though we don't all agree on all aspects of it, it's kind of a bind that we can appreciate. And because of that, you can get a lot of support. You can have a kind of accountability, you know, and you have like a really healthy and continuous feedback loop. So that's because we all have this aspect of what we're doing that focuses on individual liberty. We're in a community that was built on that very idea. So there's really a lot there, I think, to be grateful for. And I've realized that in multiple ways, being in New Hampshire over the last 7 or 8 years, and being a little long-winded because I'm actually in this introspective period where I'm actually thinking about leaving New Hampshire for the first time, for nothing to do with the Free State Project. But I've been here 10 years, more than 10 years, you know? And I think it might be time for something else, but I'm perfectly, I'm really trying to weigh this and realize what I'll be leaving behind as far as School Sucks is concerned, and it's pretty significant. So it's one of the reasons I'm still here.
We'll start with you on this next question.
Sure.
So I'm a voracious, sorry, go ahead. I didn't.
So sure, that was actually a good lead-in. Because as libertarians, often we think of or focus on the individual or individualism. And I know for myself, sometimes I actually have a hard time feeling motivated by making somebody else think something. I don't necessarily really want to make somebody else think something. So I'm curious what your relationship is to your respective audiences, how and why you're talking to, who you think you're talking to, and what you're expecting in terms of your relationship. Beyond your message and beyond expressing yourself, who are you talking to and why are you spending the time doing that?
Yeah, go ahead.
That's a great question. So this has changed for me a lot. When I first started podcasting, I think some of it maybe had to do with my age or just life experience, but when I first started podcasting, I had a mission to change the world. I wanted to, inspire people to have better communication and better relationships, and I wanted them to think about freedom and liberty and think about themselves and do some self-reflection. And, there's not a single point at which this changed, but eventually I just woke up and I realized, you know what? This isn't really the most important thing. The most important thing is, I can do those things in myself. I can try to become better at all those things I just mentioned, and I can work on myself. But changing other people's minds is an uphill battle a lot of times, and you're going to end up disappointed. And the best thing you can really do is just, maybe show an example, but do it for fun, right? Like, do a podcast for fun, not because you think you're going to change the world. You may still end up changing the world, but if you start out with that as your goal, sometimes it's not the most effective thing, and you can end up really disappointed. So now I literally just do podcasts because it's fun and I love it, and I talk about stuff that's funny and interesting to me. And ironically, Brian and I get a lot of messages, because we're a couple, in case anybody didn't know, but we get a lot of messages from people saying like, oh, wow, listening to your podcast changed my life. Ironically, now that we're not trying to change anybody's life. So, yeah.
So I'm going to still tagline from a different podcast. Freedom begins between the ears. Rodger was on that show. So my podcast is really about some of the stuff that just Stephanie just talked about. It's not necessarily about libertarianism, but it's about trying to find who you are. And I do think that's where this journey started. That's where this journey started with me. I think we have so much social conditioning and all this programming that we're just given that we don't even know that we're stuck with it. So my intent with my podcast is to interview people and figure out that journey that they took. And I don't care if they're a libertarian or not, but just hearing that when that light switch goes off for them at some point in their life, to me, that helps me examine, are there other aspects of my life that I'm just on cruise control that I didn't know about? And I hope that's what my audience takes away.
Sure, so I'm like the one podcaster who will tell you actually, so I'm kind of glad nobody raised their hand, because I'm the one that'll tell you don't listen to my show. Like, never listen to it. It's not that it's terrible, I think it's actually really good, but I'd almost rather people not like know that, kind of, I guess, that aspect of me. But again, kind of what I mentioned earlier about the why do I do it? Is it to reach out to people? Not really. I mean, maybe in a way I'm looking for some justification that the things that I'm into and the things that I want to share are okay, I mean, we kind of grow up in a permission-based culture where, we don't think things are okay until we ask some kind of authority or something like that. Or maybe, it feels good to get from peers that, oh, no, that's good. I mean, so I have approximately a little over 10,000 listeners per week. And again, like I tell these people almost every week, and in fact, I yell at them. Sometimes I insult them even. Not that I really mean them, I love them that they listen to the show. But yeah, don't listen to me. And one thing I make also very clear is don't consider me a thought leader. I never want to be L. Rond. I don't want to be, in libertarianism, there's a massive problem where people worship libertarian Jesus-I, as in plural Jesuses, which I think is a really big issue. And so I try to be the antithesis of that in a very real sense. And I think that that's important for people to, like Stephanie was saying, don't try, just if you can do this for fun, if you can just get out there, if you're just getting out aspects of yourself, getting your rocks off, whatever, doing this, then go for that. I mean, with my show, it's a tech show, so I also have the advantage of where, when I'm telling people, okay, use something as simple as use Firefox, that helps everybody. When people secure their computers, their devices and everything, that helps all of us. And so I have the advantage of, I guess, maybe I'm kind of changing the world in that way. And yes, I do want people using these things, and I get that aspect of it. But really, yeah, going into podcasting thinking I want to change the world, like Stephanie said, I think is that you might want to hit up some therapy on that. It's just my thought. Anyway.
One more comment, quick. Your audience can end up changing you. I mean, I found that was the case for me, like you were saying, Tom, through your interviews, but not just the guests that you have on the show, but people that you meet through the show. When you put yourself out there on the internet and you're being yourself, you're going to attract people who are really clicking with you, even if it is like a one-sided relationship at first. Sometimes those do turn into real relationships, and you can learn so much stuff from those people you meet through putting yourself out there. So even, as someone who I consider myself pretty introverted, and meeting people in person sometimes gets a little bit overwhelming for me. But if we start out having the basis of where they listen to my show and they like what I have to say and they kept listening, that can be the basis for an extraordinary friendship, just sort of right out of the box. And you didn't even know that it was forming. Like, all these potential friendships are out there just incubating when you do a podcast, and then eventually you meet the person in person and they can teach you so much stuff. So.
As Brian was saying, that piece about libertarian Jesus-I, right? I was pulling a quote. It's a well-known quote in the marketing world, and it speaks to that pretty well. People will do anything, and some other media personalities might come to mind as I read this. People will do anything for those who encourage their dreams, justify their failures, allay their fears, confirm their suspicions, and help them throw rocks at their enemies, right? This is big business in the whole podcasting, the whole what's wrong with America business. That is the most successful people's MO. When I started my show in 2009, first of all, just on a tangent, I was really encouraged by Harry Brown, something he said once. He said, once you start to feel this way, start talking about it. Because you don't know how somebody else, like even if you don't always know what to do, or you don't always feel terribly resourceful, you get those ideas out there in a clear and constructive way. You don't know how somebody else is going to pick that up and run with it. And that was really encouraging to just start projecting this message outward when I did in 2009. The problem is that in 2009, when I started to find my tone or my voice as a podcaster, I had spent the previous 10 years standing in front of a classroom where the reluctantly agreed upon dynamic was I was the person who knew what I was talking about, and anybody listening to me was, could sit there if they behaved and kept their mouth shut. And as I wanted to make a show that wasn't just complaining about school or complaining about politics or promoting libertarianism, that was actually about something constructive, I found that I really needed to change that tone. Because as life went on, it was really easy in 2009 and 2010, before anyone started to catch on to me, to just get in front of that microphone, anonymously almost, and sound like I knew exactly what I was talking about, and that I had figured everything out. But as life went on in 2011, in 2012, in 2013, a lot of my own personal imperfections became very apparent in a way that I couldn't ignore, and I felt really out of integrity, talking as if I had figured everything out. So I started to change the tone of the show and say, look, I'm far from a perfect person. I'm a person on a journey too, a self-education journey that is not just intellectual, but emotional. I'm trying to do better professionally, and I broke that formula that I read to you, but the truth is I was never going to be able to maintain that anyway. And I don't know how some of the people are able to do that. Or maybe these things have just never occurred to them, that they have their own unique struggles and challenges and uncertainties. But I couldn't hide mine. So I said, I'm a person who's on a journey with lots of questions, and I'm trying to teach myself. And if you want to come along with me, especially once I realized that most people in the audience were not kids, they were adults who were at least as smart as me and had figured out at least as much about life. I said, this is obviously something that is continuous, and it's something that we can work on together. And I knew there was very little that I could, to the audience as a whole, that I could speak, or wisdom that I could impart that nobody else had figured out. It kind of goes back to that previous question. People come and listen and stay for the personality of the person behind the microphone. So I had to get honest with myself, and I had to get honest, with the people in the audience about who that person actually was, and even that's a continuous process. But that's it. I'm out of steam. So there we go.
Do you have any questions from out here? No, 5 minutes, okay. So this will be the last question, I believe. As a voracious podcast listener, I even listen to podcasts about podcasting, just to learn. And of course at 2.75 or 3 speed always. But every podcaster has that moment where their podcast has brought them something, some moment of something that they would not have had without their podcast. For me, I now live in New Hampshire, and I get to hang out with awesome people like this because of my podcast. So what is your kind of because of my podcast story?
Because of my podcast, in 2013, I did something I never thought I would do, and I changed careers completely. As I mentioned, I used to be a scientist, but I wasn't just a scientist. I was actually on track to become a physician scientist. I was going to do medical research and get an MD and a PhD. I only ended up completing the PhD, but that was because I chose to go off of that career path and become a voice actor instead. And so now I sit at home and narrate audiobooks in my pajamas, do a podcast, and have a blast. And ever since then, that was about 5 years ago that I made the switch, and I have never regretted it. I'm so happy I did that. And it was all because I started that podcast as a hobby, almost as a joke, talking about, relationship advice on the internet. And it became so fun and so meaningful that it showed me that I wanted my life to take a radically different direction. Top that.
Tom, no, you go.
Sorry. Between October 15th and November 25th of last year, I was able to do a cross-country and back tour called School Sucks Across America because of my podcast. Having built an audience all across the country, the longest I had to drive without finding a person willing to put me up and feed me was about 5 hours. So I stopped, I think, 30 times between here and Los Angeles, and I actually organized the trip around an event that we were doing in November in Los Angeles. 30 stops on the way out, maybe about 10 on the way back. I met a lot of people, interviewed a lot of people in the audience, was really inspired, and I got to do the kind of thing that I always wanted to do, but is a bit of a stretch financially. It still kind of was, but I'm really glad that I did it, and I was really motivated to do it by, not just having the opportunity to meet these people, but also, there was a kind of an accountability in this. Like, this is something that I really want to do. I'm going to just tell thousands of people that I'm going to do it, and then I guess I kind of have to, So, and it was a huge success. It was the greatest decision I ever made in my life. It was entirely because I do the show.
So we'll let Tom have the last word. They're going to remember you. So 17 emails. Obviously, my show's been going 6 years. Like I said, over 10,000 listeners. I get a lot more than 17 emails in that time frame. But I've gotten 17 emails. Like Rodger said, I previously served in the U.S. Army. I'm not proud of that at all. I've gotten 17 emails from service people because of a little tech show that I run that they said, "You've inspired me to leave the military." So I'm not going to say I have all the courage in the world, but I will absolutely say I had Sovryn Tech, my show, had a very small part in shrinking the size of the war machine that exists in this world that seems to be unstoppable. No, it's not. That means everything to me. Absolutely everything, and I'll keep doing the show forever if it means that there's even one more email. So that's it for me.
Top that, Tom.
Yeah, so I have to follow 3 of them. And, I should have went first. So I haven't had an epiphany like the 3 of them at this point. But to go back to what Brian had mentioned, when I set out on the show, and even the Free State Project, when I first got involved way back in the day, my whole intention was if I could not change the world, but just if I could get 2 people to see the light, that replaces me and it grows the movement by 1. That's been my whole intent, and I've got multiple emails before that are like, "Oh my God, thank you! I didn't realize I did this to my family or my spouse or my children or whatever." So every time you get one of those emails, it gives you so much fuel to just move forward and whatever you're dealing with in life. Or like, oh man, I got to sit down for 3 hours and edit another freaking podcast. And
But it's confirmation,
It's amazing.
Yeah. Absolutely. So let's give these guys a huge round of applause. Thanks so much, Tom, Stephanie, Brian, Brett. So tonight at 7 o'clock at Gaucho's Brazilian Steakhouse, we're having a media, podcasters and other media dinner there. So please, feel free to come join us. I think some of the folks here on the panel will be there with us tonight. Also, don't forget to get your PorkFest tickets. I know these 2 of our panelists here will be speaking at PorkFest this year. So make sure to go by the PorkFest table and get your tickets for that. And thank you so much for participating.